The voyages of Christopher Columbus are considered a turning point in human history, marking the beginning of a new era in which profound demographic, commercial, and political changes led to the permanent contact between continents and ultimately to globalization. But the explorer's legacy is still subject to controversy 5 centuries later. Some voices deny him the reputation of the discoverer of the New World, bringing into discussion the Norsemen who are believed to have reached North America 500 years before him. Others argue that no matter who crossed the Atlantic first, Columbus was the first European to have discovered how to sail across the ocean and return, thus opening the way to all the other explorers who followed and finally drew the contours of the new continent on the map. In recent years, there has been a heated debate between those who criticize him for his brutality and for initiating what they call a genocide against the indigenous population of the American continent, and those who bring to his defense the fact that the events that followed were beyond his reach or knowledge. Consuelo Varela, a reputed Spanish historian, thinks that even those who loved him have to admit the atrocities that had taken place. At the same time, other scholars state that, though it cannot be disputed that the colonial experience was a disaster for the natives, the decimation of the American population was mainly the result of the lack of immunity to diseases that the Europeans unknowingly brought with them: smallpox, typhoid fever, mumps, measles, and whooping cough. Also, they remind the public that, although that cannot be accepted as an excuse, the behavior of the natives themselves had been marked by the same brutality, not only against the Europeans, but against each other. As for our knowledge about the cruelties suffered by the indigenous peoples, it is precisely the result of the 16th century Spanish passion for justice, those who violated well-established principles of morality having been condemned and punished in courts. Among all the questions arising on the consequences of the encounter between the Europeans and the New World, one of the most complicated is that of slavery. But before we move on to that, if you enjoy my videos, please subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so that you don't miss the next ones. Unquestionably, in the 15th century, slavery was a universal practice, though of different types and intensities in different areas. We know that Europeans reaching the west coast of Africa found already existing slave trading networks, and that Columbus found in the New World natives, enslaving and being enslaved by their neighboring populations. Less is known about how Columbus and other Italian merchants involved in the slave trade operated in a rapidly changing moral climate that, by 1500, criminalized their activities. In 1494, during his second journey, Columbus sent to his creditors in Seville, Gianotto Braudi and Francesco Pinelli, 27 natives, with explicit instructions that they would be sold on the slave market. In 1495, the 300 slaves that had survived the crossing of the Atlantic, out of the 500 sent by Columbus, were delivered directly to Cardinal Fonseca as a commodity meant to substitute the precious merchandise the crown was expecting from the Indies. Fonseca wrote to the monarchs transmitting Columbus's instructions for the sale, but expressed his doubts about the procedures and morality of this endeavor. Therefore, this second shipment gave birth to a moral dilemma for the Spanish sovereigns. Slavery, which can be traced back to the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, through those of Greece and Rome, and throughout the Native American societies long before Columbus's voyages, was based upon the belief that humans were not born equal. Relying upon the thinking of Plato and Aristotle, Greek philosophy distinguished between slavery by nature, as a consequence of a natural higher or lower possession of virtues, wisdom, and intelligence, and slavery by law or convention. In the case of the latter, even those who had been born free men could lose their freedom and become slaves due to war, according to the law stating that whatever is taken in war is supposed to belong to the victors. Nevertheless, Aristotle also introduced the just war theory, which was later developed by the fathers of the Church. For a war to be just, Thomas Aquinas states 3 conditions. Firstly, the war has to be authorized by a recognized ruler of a known territory or kingdom. Secondly, the reason for carrying out the war must be genuine. And lastly, there has to be an intention of using the war to bring about something good and to avoid evil. This justification of both slavery and the just war theory was entirely accepted by the moral theologians of both Spanish and Portuguese origins in the 15th and 16th centuries. Still, during the 15th century, Spain's long tradition of slavery began to be questioned due to unusual circumstances. In the late 14th century, following the enslavement of Greek Orthodox prisoners of war by Catalan mercenary armies, the Catalan king appealed to the papacy for guidance. Pope Clement VII ruled that the Orthodox were Christians. Therefore, they could not be enslaved by other Christians. The next problem arose with the conquest of the Canary Islands. During the 1480s, enslaved Canarians petitioned the monarchs for their freedom, arguing that they had peacefully become the crown's subjects and converted to Christianity. Due to these precedents, Ferdinand and Isabel received the shipments of enslaved Native Americans with growing discomfort. Their moral conundrum did not concern slavery per se, as was demonstrated during the war against Granada, when hundreds of Muslims and Jews had been enslaved and then distributed to different markets and destinations throughout the Mediterranean. These enslavements were not condemned by European or Spanish society. On the contrary, they were regarded as virtuous acts because they saved lives while reimbursing the royal coffers for the expenses of the war. While some of the slaves were exchanged for Christians held in slavery in North Africa, others were sent as a gift to the Castilian nobility, the King of Portugal, and even the Pope, who redistributed a part of them, without any moral qualms, to the cardinals and princes of the Church. The ethical dilemma of the Spanish monarchs regarded enslaving their own people. Columbus fought back, describing the natives as neither civilized nor assimilable, in striking discordance with his own previous accounts. He tried to justify their enslavement, stating that they had been rebelling against the lawful government of the Queen, thus being enslaved as a result of a just war. Nevertheless, the monarchs stopped the selling of the 300 natives sent in 1495. It took another 5 years and dozens of consultations with theologians and lawyers in order to ascertain whether these natives could be sold, quote, with a clear conscience, end of quote. Finally, in June 1500, Queen Isabel issued a royal edict forbidding the enslavement of the subjects of the Castilian crown. 10 years later, Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas, who advocated for the suffering Native Americans, was also the one who suggested to King Ferdinand that black Africans should be used to replace them for the work on the plantations. Following this suggestion, in 1510 King Ferdinand gave permission to import black African slaves directly from the West African Atlantic coasts to the Americas. This was how the ball was rolled into motion for the take-off of the transatlantic slave trade. Nevertheless, we can regard these attempts to define new categories of people who could not be enslaved as small steps that eventually led to our modern rejection of any form of slavery. As for Columbus, at least some scholars caution against an historical judgment based on the morals and laws of the 21st century, adding that if these criteria were applied to past personalities, very few would be saved. According to the Italian scholar Luciano Gallinari, the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus made possible, at least in theory, the recognition of the plurality of regions, peoples and cultures that is the basis of the modern-day conception of the universe. If you want to find out why the American continent was not named after Columbus, and hear the story of the first map bearing the name America, please join me for the next video.